The summer fete at Thornhill Hall it was by every villager's reckoning the most splendid afternoon St. Aldhelm's had seen that year. Even the English weather, so notoriously capricious, had conspired to perfection, the sky a flawless blue arched over Thornhill Hall's ancient gables, and the June sunlight slanted in buttery beams across the emerald lawns. Every garden border was in full bloom, the heavy scent of peonies and sweet peas mingling with the faint tang of cut grass and lemonade. The fete at Thornhill Hall was an event of tradition resilient as the halls old, hedge reliably marking the height of summer, when all the cares and tempers of village life were briefly suspended in the golden haze. A crowd had gathered, as was custom. The vicar presided over the coconut shy, occasionally ducking a wild ball from an overzealous child. At the far end, past the rose beds and beneath a fluttering string of bunting, Mrs. Arbuthnot, the butcher's wife, fussed over. Tables of Victoria sponges and fat scones, occasionally swatting away the bees who shared her passion for strawberry jam. The brass band, composed of local men who were at least as old as their instruments, filled the air with cheery if slightly off-key marches. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her accustomed place near the rose garden, ensconced in a creaking wicker chair. She wore a dove-gray straw hat, its faded ribbon carefully fluffed, and her gloved hands rested in her lap atop a well-folded napkin and a wedge of homemade seed cake. Her expression was one of benign contentment, but her eyes clear, sharp, and unblinking as a bird's took in the scene with a subtle scrutiny most people would never suspect from a gentlewoman of her years. Around her, the polite chatter of St. Aldhelm's rose and fell in pleasant waves, but beneath it ran the ever-present undercurrent of village curiosity now firmly fixed upon the mysterious new mistress of Thornhill Hall. Mrs. Cordelia Drummond had arrived a mere month before, accompanied by her stepson, Simon, and a slight staff of London servants whose starched uniforms and clipped accents seemed slightly out of place in the bucolic peace of the Cotswolds. The Drummonds, despite their reticence, had extended a generous invitation to the fete. Their sudden openness was the subject of much speculation. "I declare, Jane, it's simply delicious," whispered Mrs. Dolly Bantry, bustling over with 2 cups of weak tea, her plump cheeks flushed with excitement and heat. "No one knows the least thing about her, except, of course, that dreadful business in Johannesburg, though I'm sure it's all just silly rumor. Do you suppose she really was left penniless? Or is it all for show, do you think?" Miss Marple, accepting her tea with a nod of thanks, replied in her quiet, measured way, "I find, dear Dolly, that what people choose not to say is often more telling than the things they do. But it is early days yet. The Drummonds may simply be shy, or perhaps Mrs. Drummond is cautious after all she has suffered." Dolly grinned, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Shy, just look at her, Jane, she's positively holding court." Indeed, Mrs. Drummond was a striking figure, tall, almost statuesque, her silver blonde hair elegantly arranged beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her navy silk dress perfectly pressed. She stood on the stone terrace, flanked by Dr. Graham, the local physician, and Mr. Peter Linton, who ran the bank in nearby Broadway. Her laughter, a low, throaty sound carried across the lawn. By her side lingered Simon Drummond, a man of perhaps 35, with sallow skin and nervous eyes that flitted continually from one group to another. His hands moved restlessly in his pockets. Miss Marple noted his wary posture, the almost imperceptible way he shrank from his stepmother's touch, and the thin line of tension around his mouth. Elsewhere, Miss Clara Stokes, for years the unofficial queen of St. Aldhelm's society, hovered near the refreshment tent, lips pursed, watching Mrs. Drummond with an expression that mixed curiosity and resentment. She was a tall, angular woman with a fondness for starched collars and unvarnished opinions, and she had not taken kindly to the arrival of a new contender for village attention. Children shrieked with laughter at the sack race. Elderly gentlemen debated the merits of this year's rose entries. Young couples strolled, arms entwined, stealing kisses behind the hollyhocks. All the while, the gossip swirled, as persistent and invisible as the dandelion seeds drifting on the breeze. Miss Marple, for her part, watched quietly. She noticed the details others missed, The way Mrs. Drummond's eyes darted, calculating, appraising each time she was introduced to a new villager. The clipped words exchanged between Simon and Peter Linton when they thought themselves unobserved. The slight, sudden pallor that crept over Mrs. Wilmot, the doctor's housekeeper, whenever the subject of Johannesburg arose in conversation. By 4 o'clock the fete was in full swing. The cakes dwindled, replaced by lemonade and tart slices of gooseberry pie. The air grew heavy with heat and the soporific hum of bees. Miss Marple nibbled her seed cake and smiled absently at Mrs. Bantry's account of the most recent scandal at the Women's Institute. And then a scream. Not the shriek of a child, but a thin, high, desperate note that cut through the laughter and the music, cleaving the afternoon in two. Heads turned. There, at the edge of the orchard, Mrs. Wilmot stood, one hand gripping her sun hat, the other trembling violently at her side. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror so raw it startled even the bravest among them. "It's someone's— oh, help! Please someone come," she gasped, and her knees seemed to buckle. The crowd hesitated. In that frozen instant, the spell of the fete broke, replaced by a collective, primal dread. Mrs. Bantry clapped a hand to her mouth. The vicar hurried forward, his cassock flapping. Peter Linton strode briskly across the lawn, barking orders at nobody in particular. Children were ushered away, some already sobbing. Miss Marple, with surprising swiftness for a woman of her years, rose from her chair. She moved at her own pace and hurry, but steady through the press of villagers, her sharp eyes missing nothing. In the orchard, beneath a gnarled apple tree, a figure lay sprawled among the roots and fallen blossoms. The basket of gooseberries nearby had overturned, scattering its contents across the grass. The hand, pale and still, was turned palm up in a gesture both pleading and final. The villagers clustered together, murmurs rising, some craning for a better view, others averting their gaze in horror. Dr. Graham, breathless, knelt and pressed his fingers to the neck of the fallen woman. Seconds ticked by. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. "I'm afraid she's dead," the doctor said at last, voice barely audible. Gasps and whispers swept the gathering. Someone began to weep. Others stared, stunned. Miss Marple, standing a little apart, fixed her gaze upon the tableau. The body, the basket, the scattered fruit, the faint mark— was it a bruise? At the throat? The victim, as she suspected before anyone else dared to guess, was not a stranger, nor a servant, but one of their own. Mrs. Bantry's hand gripped Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, who would do such a thing?" But Miss Marple only pursed her lips, watching as the scene unfolded each reaction. Every hurried whisper, the subtle shuffling of feet. She listened carefully, filing away each detail. She had learned long ago that murder in a village was never simple, never as it first appeared. As the shocked villagers began to cluster and speculate, Miss Marple knew, quietly and certainly, that this was no ordinary tragedy. The secrets of Thornhill Hall and of its new mistress were only just beginning to emerge. And so, as dusk crept along the lawn and the fete dissolved into stunned silence, Miss Marple took a single step toward the orchard, ready to listen, watch, and above all understand. "Cordelia, I must ask, did you see anything? Anyone near the orchard in the last half hour?" Mrs. Drummond shook her head slowly, her gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance. "No, nothing at all. I was with Mrs. Arbuthnot by the cake tables, then with Simon near the bandstand. I didn't even realize— oh, this is dreadful, simply dreadful." Simon Drummond, standing slightly apart, chewed at his lower lip and stared at the ground, hands shoved deep in his pockets. His sallow complexion had grown even paler. Miss Marple, never one to miss the smallest signal, noted how he glanced almost furtively at the orchard gate, then back at the crowd as if measuring the distance. A flurry of conversation began, urgent and overlapping. "Who is it, doctor?" called Mr. Linton, voice tense. Dr. Graham hesitated, looking down at the figure. "It's Mrs. Edith Wilmot." "I'm afraid there's no doubt." A murmur passed through the villagers like a breeze stirring tall grass. Mrs. Wilmot, the doctor's housekeeper, and a figure as much a part of St. Aldhelm's fabric as the church clock or the postbox. She had always seemed ageless brisk, sharp-eyed, quietly capable. To see her, now, felled so suddenly and violently, was unthinkable. Mrs. Bantry, pale and shaking, hovered at Miss Marple's elbow. Edith Wilmot! But who could possibly? She had no enemies. None at all. Jane, do you suppose it could have been an accident? Miss Marple murmured something non-committal, her gaze returning to the orchard. Already the details began to arrange themselves in her mind. The position of the basket, the way Mrs. Wilmot's hat had rolled away, the faint mark at her throat that even now the doctor tried to shield from the onlooker's gaze. No, this was no accident, but she would say nothing yet. Within half an hour the fate had dissolved into chaos and confusion. Several villagers hurried away, eager to share the dreadful news. Others clustered together, voices low and urgent. Only a handful remained in the orchard. Dr. Graham, Peter Linton, Miss Marple, and, in her composed but shaken state, Mrs. Drummond. The arrival of Constable Bryce, with his notebook and air of grave responsibility, marked the transition from horror to investigation. He nodded respectfully to Miss Marple, no stranger to her quiet skills, and then to Dr. Graham. Right. Sir, I'll need to ask some questions. He consulted his watch, then knelt beside the body. Time of death? Best estimate? Dr. Graham cleared his throat. Likely within the past 40 minutes, Constable. I last saw Mrs. Wilmot at about 3:20 when she brought me a message from the kitchen. I was at the far end of the garden after that. She could have come here. Well, any time after, really. And you, Mrs. Drummond? Bryce turned to the hostess. I was with guests, Constable, she replied, voice trembling but clear. Mrs. Arbuthnot can confirm, as can Simon. She nodded at her stepson, who seemed to shrink under the sudden scrutiny. Constable Bryce took down these statements carefully, then asked the question lingering on everyone's mind. Anyone see anything unusual? Anyone near the orchard who didn't belong? A flurry of denials followed. Peter Linton cleared his throat and offered, I did see Mrs. Wilmot leave the tent with a basket just before the band played Jerusalem. She said she needed apples for the tarts, but she seemed quite herself. Simon, still silent, watched Bryce with an odd intensity. His fingers worked at the lining of his pocket, his gaze darting from face to face. Miss Marple noticed all of this, though she herself said little, her answers polite, her observations discreet. She watched Simon, but also Mrs. Drummond, who appeared to be holding herself together by willpower alone. Once their eyes met, and Miss Marple thought she glimpsed a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or guilt, or a deeper exhaustion. Then it was gone. The constable, with a gentle authority, began to disperse the crowd. Go home, please, all of you. I'll need to speak with some of you again, but for now, give the doctor and Mrs. Drummond some peace. Miss Marple, if you wouldn't mind staying a moment. Miss Marple inclined her head. She waited as the orchard cleared, the murmurs and questions trailing away like ripples on a pond. Only Mrs. Bantry lingered, unwilling to leave her friend's side. Bryce approached Miss Marple, lowering his voice. You've a knack for seeing what others don't, Miss Marple. Did you notice anything out of place? Miss Marple's answer was soft but pointed. It struck me, Constable, that Mrs. Wilmot's basket was empty except for a single apple, bruised and unpicked. And there was a mark on her neck, not made by a fall. I'm sure you noticed it too, Bryce nodded gravely. The doctor says it could be a blow or someone's hand. There's no sign of a weapon, and her purse is untouched. Miss Marple's gaze was distant, thoughtful. It's strange, isn't it, how evil so often wears an ordinary face? St. Aldhelm's is not immune to secrets, I fear. The constable glanced uneasily at Mrs. Drummond, who now sat beneath the apple tree, her dress immaculate but her eyes rimmed red. Simon hovered at her side, almost as if he feared to leave or be left alone with his stepmother. Bryce pocketed his notebook. I'll have to notify Inspector Croft. This is no country accident. Miss Marple nodded. You'll find, I expect, that what happened here has its roots in old grievances, old wounds. Her voice was so gentle it might have been a prayer. As dusk bled into evening, the hall grew quiet. Mrs. Drummond, pale and subdued, withdrew. With Simon and her housekeeper, Dr. Graham walked slowly back toward the village, his steps heavy. Peter Linton lingered by the gate, lost in thought. Miss Marple, arm in arm with Mrs. Bantry, followed the gravel path back toward the main house. The fete had ended, leaving behind only the trampled grass, a scattering of empty teacups, and a village full of uneasy hearts. Mrs. Bantry broke the silence at last. "Jane, do you really think someone in our own village could do such a thing? It doesn't seem possible." Miss Marple paused, gazing back at the orchard now bathed in the bruised light of twilight. "My dear Dolly, people are capable of anything, given the proper provocation, and often the most terrible acts are committed not by strangers, but by those we think we know best." They walked on, the faint sounds of the village closing. Doors, a distant dog barking, settling into the uneasy hush that followed tragedy. Inside Thornhill Hall, lamps glimmered behind thick curtains, the house seeming to hold its breath. Upstairs, Mrs. Drummond sat motionless at her writing desk, staring at an untouched letter. Down the corridor, Simon's footsteps could be heard, pacing 1, 2, 3, turned like a caged animal. And in the darkness of the orchard, a single apple, bruised and uneaten, glimmered faintly in the grass. It was a silent witness, waiting like Miss Marple for the truth to begin its slow, inexorable rise to the surface. Chapter 2. The village reacts. The news traveled through St. Aldhelms as swiftly and surely as the summer wind itself. Even before the last guests had left Thornhill Hall, before Mrs. Wilmot's body had been respectfully covered and the constable had finished scribbling in his notebook, the whispers had begun spreading from doorstep to shop counter, from the post office to the snug bar of the Golden Lion. By morning, the sun rose pale and uncertain over a village transformed. St. Aldhelms, so recently bustling with cakes and laughter, was now gripped by a tension as keen and invisible as piano. Wire. The shops opened late. The postmistress fumbled the morning letters. Even the dogs, usually bickering and bounding on the green, seemed subdued, their owners speaking in quiet voices. Miss Marple, for her part, began her day much as she always did. She took her tea promptly at 7:30, wrote 3 letters. One to her niece in London, one to an old friend in Chipping Cleghorn, and one, brief and carefully worded, to the Women's Institute chair, and then set out for her customary morning walk around the village. But today she found herself watched surreptitiously, but keenly by nearly every person she encountered. Her first stop was at the grocer's, where young Bessie Pratt greeted her with anxious eyes. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it awful?" "Poor Mrs. Wilmot, and at the Hall of all places?" Ma says she heard shouting near the orchard, but I told her it must have just been the fete, what with all the children about. Miss Marple accepted her half-pound of tea and a small brown loaf with polite gratitude. "People sometimes imagine more noise than there truly is, Bessie. We mustn't let ourselves get carried away by rumor. Still, we should always keep our ears open for what's true." Outside, Miss Marple paused by the notice board where a small cluster of villagers had gathered. Mr. Finch, the village's oldest resident, was shaking his head and offering his view to anyone within earshot. "It's foreign ways, that's what it is. London staff, fancy doings at the hall. Nothing good ever came of such changes. Mark my words, it's outsiders that bring trouble." Across the green, Mrs. Arbuthnot, her apron still dusted with flour, was in earnest conference with the vicar's wife. She was always such a quiet woman, Edith. I can't recall her ever raising her voice, not even to the children. But they say she'd been in the state all week, fretting about something. "You don't think it could have been, well, blackmail?" She whispered the last word, wide-eyed. Mrs. Bantry, bustling up, intercepted Miss Marple as she left. The crowd. "Jane, you must come for tea this afternoon. The inspector is coming to speak to Arthur, and you always know what to look for. Did you hear they're saying it might have been a quarrel over money? Or even a lover?" Miss Marple's mouth twitched in the ghost of a smile. "People do love to embroider, Dolly. Let us wait for facts. In my experience, the simplest explanation is rarely the correct one in these matters." By midday, Inspector Croft had arrived from the county town, a short, Square man with shrewd gray eyes and a voice made for quiet command. He wasted no time in calling at Thornhill Hall, where Mrs. Drummond awaited him in her drawing room, her composure restored if not entirely unshaken. Simon sat by the window, silent as ever, flicking idly through a book, but not turning a single page. Croft's questions were brisk but fair, and he took copious notes as Mrs. Drummond recounted her movements during the fete. You saw nothing out of the ordinary? No stranger lurking near the orchard? Nothing at all, Inspector, Mrs. Drummond replied, her tone almost too calm. It was a perfectly ordinary afternoon until Mrs. Wilmot was found. And you, Mr. Drummond? The inspector turned to Simon, who blinked and looked up with the air of a schoolboy summoned to recite. I was near the bandstand, as I said before. I went to fetch lemonade and then came back when I heard the commotion. That's all. Croft's pen scratched against his pad. And the servants? Did anyone see or hear anything unusual? Mrs. Drummond hesitated. You may wish to speak with my housekeeper, Mrs. Dilly. She was supervising the kitchen staff. But I doubt any of them could have left their posts. It was a busy afternoon. Croft nodded and excused himself, but not before glancing sharply at Simon. If you recall anything else, do let us know at once. Miss Marple, who had been quietly shown in by Mrs. Dilly herself, was invited to take tea in the parlor. Croft joined her, folding his notes with military precision. He lowered his voice. You've seen more than your share of village unpleasantness. Miss Marple, I'd welcome your impressions. She nodded. Thank you, Inspector. May I ask, was there anything missing from Mrs. Wilmot's person? Any sign of a struggle? Croft shook his head. No, her basket was overturned and one apple bruised, but nothing else disturbed. Her purse, watch, and brooch were untouched. Miss Marple sipped her tea. The mark on her neck was not an accident, nor, I think, the only mark that may matter in this case. People forget, Inspector, that the wounds unseen are often the most telling. I suspect Mrs. Wilmot knew something or saw something she ought not to have. Croft's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. You believe she was silenced? Miss Marple smiled gently, her gaze wandering over the faded tapestry on the parlor wall. I believe, Inspector, that one must always consider motive before opportunity. In a village there are always secrets. But not all secrets are deadly. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind a bank of clouds, a small, unofficial council assembled at the vicarage, the vicar, Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Graham, and, at Mrs. Bantry's determined insistence, Miss Marple. The talk was low and anxious. Dr. Graham looked haggard, his usual confidence gone. I can't imagine who would wish Edith harm. She'd been with me for 20 years. If there were troubles, she kept them to herself. But she did seem agitated lately. I thought it was just the pressures of the fate. Mrs. Bantry pressed her lips together. And you're sure it wasn't an accident? The doctor hesitated. The bruise. No, it wasn't a fall. It was too deliberate, too precise. The vicar, a gentle soul much more at home with sermons than murder, cleared his throat. We must pray for Edith's soul and for the soul of her assailant, whoever they may be. But Jane, do you think it could have been a stranger passing through? Miss Marple shook her head. That seems unlikely. This was not a crime of impulse or passion. It was planned. Mrs. Wilmot was lured to the orchard, I am sure of it, under the pretense of some errand or message. Someone she trusted or, at least, did not fear. The group fell silent, the implications settling like dust in the fading light. Late that evening, as lamplight pooled softly in the village windows, Miss Marple sat at her own writing desk, her knitting set aside. She reflected on the faces she had seen that day, Mrs. Drummond, all porcelain poise and measured grief. Simon, restless and twitching, his alibis curiously vague. Peter Linton, whose concern for the family seemed tinged with something more personal. And even Dr. Graham, whose closeness to Mrs. Wilmot had seemed almost paternal but not entirely. Miss Marple's blue eyes narrowed in thought. In every village, she mused, there were rivalries and slights, grievances old as time. Yet murder was rare, so rare that it always pointed to something extraordinary lurking beneath the surface. She took up her notebook and wrote a single line. Who Benefits Most by Edith Wilmot's silence. Down the lane, the lamps of Thornhill Hall gleamed against the night. Within its walls, secrets shifted uneasily in the dark, and the first cracks of suspicion began to widen. Miss Marple closed her notebook and gazed out at the moonlit garden, her heart both heavy and resolved. The game had begun. Secrets in the shadows. The following day, Thornhill Hall stood wreathed in a hush deeper than the ordinary peace of country mornings. The hall's high windows reflected a sullen sky, and the lawns, usually a tapestry of color and life, seemed shrunken, as if the tragedy had drained them of vitality. Within its paneled halls the air was thick more with unsaid words than with the faint, sweet scent of lilac in the vases. Mrs. Drummond sat at her writing desk, her back ramrod straight, eyes tracing the lines of a half-finished letter to a cousin in Bath, yet for all her poise, her hand trembled faintly on the page. Each sound footsteps in the corridor, the distant clang of a saucepan made her flinch. A knock at the door made her start so violently that her pen splattered ink across the paper. She dabbed at the mess, composed herself, and called, "Come in." Simon entered, moving as if through water, his eyes red-rimmed and shadowed. He paused on the threshold, hands buried deep in the pockets of his morning coat, and glanced at his stepmother. "Cordelia, are you quite all right?" "Mrs." Drummond nodded, but Simon lingered, his gaze searching. "I can't stop thinking about it. Mrs. Wilmot, they say the police are going to question all the staff today." Dilly's beside herself. His stepmother's tone, when she spoke, was cool but not unkind. "There's nothing to fear if—" "One has nothing to hide, Simon. You know that." He opened his mouth as if to reply, but then closed it, retreating to the window. Outside, the village glimmered under a thin drizzle, the world seemingly shrunk to the hall and its secrets. After a moment, Mrs. Drummond rose and crossed to her stepson. She laid a hand lightly on his arm. "Simon, did you see anything that afternoon? Anything odd? Anyone near the orchard who shouldn't have been?" Simon looked at her, startled. "No, I told the inspector already. I saw Mrs. Wilmot with the basket near the orchard, but she seemed just herself." He hesitated, chewing his lip. "There's been talk in the village. They say Mrs. Wilmot had been worried lately, that she argued with someone before the fete. Did you hear anything?" Mrs. Drummond shook her head. "No arguments. At least none that reach my ears. But you know how people talk, Simon. Let's not lend weight to every shadow." She managed a faint, brittle smile, but Simon only nodded, unconvinced. Elsewhere, Miss Marple made her way through the light drizzle to Mrs. Arbuthnot's kitchen, where the comforting aromas of baking mingled with the sharper scent of village gossip. Mrs. Arbuthnot, flour on her nose and forearms, greeted her with a nervous energy. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're just in time. Sit down, do. Have some tea. It's hot, and I've just taken scones out. I suppose you've heard what Mrs. Finch saw last night?" Mrs. Arbuthnot lowered her voice conspiratorially, pouring the tea. Miss Marple's eyes widened, just enough to encourage confidence. "I haven't heard, my dear. Do tell." "She says she saw Mr. Peter Linton coming away from Thornhill Hall after dark, well, after midnight, mind. He never visits the hall after supper, not even for accounts. And he was in such a hurry. When she called good night, he hardly answered. Just mumbled and rushed away. What do you make of that?" Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "I wonder what business could have brought him so late. I suppose he and Mrs. Drummond are on cordial terms?" Mrs. Arbuthnot's cheeks flushed. "Cordial enough. But there's talk that Peter hoped for more before she came back from South Africa with young Simon. Some say he's never quite forgiven her for marrying the old Mr. Drummond instead. But I wouldn't repeat that outside these walls, Miss Marple." Miss Marple nodded. "You're wise. Still, it does seem as though everyone had reason to be near the hall, one way or another." Meanwhile, Inspector Croft was methodically questioning the hall's staff. He spoke with Mrs. Dilly first, who wrung her hands in her apron and kept glancing anxiously at the drawing-room door. "I was in the kitchen, sir, preparing the last of the tarts. I sent Mary the scullery maid for apples, but Mrs. Wilmot fetched them instead. Said she'd rather do it herself, as Mary was so clumsy." After that, I didn't see her until the shouting started. Had Mrs. Wilmot seemed upset or anxious? Croft asked. Mrs. Dilly hesitated. She did seem troubled last week, more nervous than usual. She had a letter yesterday from someone in London, and she was ever so jumpy after that. I asked if all was well, but she just said, "Some things are best left in the past, Mrs. Dilly." I thought she meant family, but perhaps. The housekeeper's voice faltered. Croft nodded and turned to Mary, who confirmed Mrs. Wilmot had intercepted her at the kitchen door. "She told me to mind the jelly, sir, and not to bother with the apples. She seemed all right. Tired, maybe." When Croft finished, he found Peter Linton in the study. The banker's composure was brittle, his handshake too firm, his smile forced. "I was home by 10, Inspector, earlier than usual. I did visit the hall after the fete, but only 2. Check on some papers Cordelia had for me. Business, nothing more." The inspector's eyes flickered. "And after that?" Peter Linton hesitated. "Straight home." "You may ask my housekeeper. I was in all night." Croft made a careful note, then asked, "Were you close to Mrs. Wilmot?" "Only as one is in a village," Linton replied quickly. She kept her own counsel. The inquest was set for the following Monday. In the meantime, the village churned with unease. The Golden Lions bar was thick with speculation. Some blamed Simon, citing his nerves. Others, Mrs. Drummond too composed. Too beautiful, too much an outsider still. Peter Linton's late-night visit set a few tongues wagging, but the banker's reputation as a pillar of respectability held sway with many. Miss Marple spent her afternoon at the vicarage, quietly piecing together the puzzle in her mind. She asked gentle questions and received more in return than most would have believed possible. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry whispered as they took tea together, "I overheard something most peculiar at the shops." Edith Wilmot was seen arguing, really raising her voice, quite out of character, near the post office just 3 days before the fete, with a woman in a dark coat. No one could say who it was. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "That is interesting. Mrs. Wilmot was rarely upset in public. Perhaps it was connected to her letter, a relative, or a ghost from the past?" Mrs. Bantry shivered. "It makes me feel quite cold." "What sort of secrets could cause murder, Jane?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "The sort best hidden, Dolly, the sort that can change everything if brought into the light." That evening, as dusk fell and a thin mist rose from the fields, Simon wandered restlessly through the hall's library, fingers trailing along the spines of untouched books. He paused at a small writing table where Mrs. Wilmot's spectacles lay forgotten. He picked them up, studying them as if hoping for answers. Outside, Miss Marple strolled past the hall's gates, eyes alert, her step unhurried. She paused at the orchard, now cordoned with a single, fluttering strand of police tape. A blackbird sang, lonely and insistent, as if protesting the silence that had settled over the trees. Miss Marple bent, picking up the single bruised apple from the grass. She weighed it in her hand, considering. Somewhere, she thought, in all these small details, in hurried footsteps, in late-night visits, in a letter left unread lay the truth. She only had to watch and wait and listen. In the shadows of Thornhill Hall, secrets pressed in from every side, thick as the mist, and the killer, whoever they were, was surely watching too. Chapter 3. Echoes and Evasions. The mist had not fully lifted the next morning, giving St. Aldhelm's a dreamlike quality as sunbeams tangled through drifting gray. The village, which once seemed so safe, now felt filled with hidden glances and silences. Behind curtains and over teacups, conversations stalled as Miss Marple's gentle footsteps tapped along the lane toward the post office. The brass bell above the door jingled. Miss Green, the postmistress, startled from her ledgers, offered a wan smile. "Miss Marple? Oh, you've picked a quiet moment." The post came late, what with all the trouble. "No one wants to speak of anything else." Miss Marple set a letter down, her eyes mild. "It is a terrible thing, Miss Green. Such a tragedy for Edith Wilmot's family. I hear she received a letter from London only the day before?" Nissa. Green's mouth tightened. "She did, and it put her in a right state. I gave it over just after tea, a proper, official-looking thing with a hand I didn't recognize. She didn't linger for chat, just tucked it into her pocket and hurried off. I thought she meant to go home, but then she was seen near the baker's. And again at the hall, seemed to be everywhere at once. Poor soul, Miss Marple nodded, thinking. And no return address? Just Hargrave Chambers, London, Miss Green replied, her curiosity piqued. I asked about it, couldn't help myself, and she said it was nothing for the likes of us, then off she went. The postmistress's voice lowered. I hope there's nothing shameful to come out at the inquest, Miss Marple. Edith was. A decent woman. Most people are, until circumstances push them otherwise, said Miss Marple, her voice almost a whisper. Down at the Golden Lion, Inspector Croft had established a makeshift interview room. Peter Linton arrived just after opening time, looking less composed than usual, his manner taut and his words clipped. Croft sat behind a polished table, taking notes. Mr. Linton, I must ask again about your late visit to Thornhill Hall. Are you certain it was only for business? Peter Linton's eyes flashed. Of course. Cordelia, Mrs. Drummond wanted my advice about a trust fund for Simon. She's unfamiliar with English law. That's all it was. Croft paused, studying. And you left at what time? 11:45? I walked straight home. My housekeeper will tell you. And before you left, did you see or speak to Mrs. Wilmot? Linton hesitated just a fraction too long. I saw her in the hall. She was carrying a tray from the library. She seemed distracted. I assumed she was finishing up before retiring. Croft made another note, but his face gave nothing away. Very good, Mr. Linton. That will be all for now. When Linton left, Croft exhaled slowly. Too precise, he muttered. Everyone remembers too precisely what they wish to be remembered for. Meanwhile, Simon Drummond had retreated to the overgrown kitchen garden, where weeds sprouted in the corners and a faint trace of time lingered in the morning air. He wandered the gravel paths, head down, as if searching for something he'd lost in the brambles. Miss Marple, never one to leave loose threads, found him there after her rounds in the village. She greeted him softly. Good morning, Simon. A peaceful place to think, isn't it? Simon started. Oh, Miss Marple. I suppose it is? It was Mrs. Wilmot's favorite spot, actually. She always said it was the only bit of order in the whole estate. Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle. Order is comforting in troubled times. Tell me, Simon, do you know why Mrs. Wilmot might have been so unsettled recently? He avoided her gaze, kicking at a stone. No idea, she kept to herself. But I heard her arguing in the library the evening before the fete, with my stepmother, I think. Their voices were low, but, well, it wasn't friendly. Cordelia denied. It when I asked, though. Families sometimes quarrel, especially after difficult changes, Miss Marple said. You've had your share of upheaval, coming back to England. Was Mrs. Wilmot close to your father? Simon frowned, as if weighing his words. Father trusted her, I think. She handled his letters. He always said she knew how to keep a secret. Did she ever mention Hargrave Chambers, London? Miss Marple asked softly. Simon shook his head, surprised. No, never. Why? Miss Marple smiled her mild, unreadable smile. Oh, just something the postmistress mentioned. Thank you, Simon. He watched her walk away, his face troubled. In the hall, Mrs. Drummond received a visit from Mrs. Bantry, who came bearing Lilla and a curiosity that was barely concealed by sympathy. They sat in the morning room, sunlight making shifting patterns on the pale carpet. My dear, Mrs. Bantry began, the village is beside itself. The talk is all suspicion and secrets. You must feel under siege. Mrs. Drummond pressed a handkerchief to her lips. I am weary, Dolly. It's as if one must account for every breath. Simon is suffering too, though he tries to hide it. Inspector Croft asks question upon question about the past, about my marriage, about Simon's future. It's unbearable. Mrs. Bantry leaned in, lowering her voice. Did you and Mrs. Wilmot quarrel, Cordelia? You needn't tell me what it was about, but... For a moment, Mrs. Drummond's composure slipped. We disagreed, yes. She was very loyal to my late husband. She hinted that I ought not trust everyone as readily as I do. She was protective of Simon, perhaps more than is strictly her place. But that's all it was. She threatened to leave, but I never dreamed. Her voice broke. Mrs. Bantry patted her hand. Sometimes people see threats where there are only worries. You mustn't let yourself be haunted by things you can't change. Mrs. Drummond managed the watery smile. Thank you, Dolly. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and carefully reread the single page she'd copied from the public record, a habit of hers in any mystery. She wrote a few more notes on the Whodunit case, letter from Hargrave Chambers. Why? Now? What claim could be revived after all these years? Peter Linton, seen late at Hall, nervous, jealous, financial dispute? Simon, frightened, but hiding what? Protective of mother or fearful for himself? Mrs. Drummond, disagreement with Mrs. Whodunit, over trust fund, or something older? A knock at her door made her jump. It was the vicar, bringing news that the inspector had called an evening meeting at the hall to set certain matters straight before the inquest. He invited Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, and Peter Linton as witnesses to the flow of the afternoon. At twilight, the hall's drawing room was somber and thick with tension. The group assembled. Mrs. Drummond pale and regal, Simon subdued, Peter Linton on edge. Mrs. Bantry nervous and talkative, Miss Marple silent and observant, Inspector Croft brisk but courteous. Croft began. I've called you here because new information has come. To light, Mrs. Whodunit's letter from Hargrave Chambers references an old trust fund established under Mr. Drummond's will, with Simon as beneficiary and Mrs. Whodunit as a named witness. Mrs. Whodunit, it seems, was contacted about an irregularity in the documents. She may have discovered something which deliberately or not endangered her. A stunned silence followed. Mrs. Drummond's face drained of color. Simon looked sharply at his stepmother, then at Linton. Croft continued, I believe Mrs. Whodunit was threatened, or at least frightened, by what she discovered. I will need statements from each of you about your knowledge of the trust, and any disagreements you may have had with Mrs. Whodunit. I trust you will be honest. He glanced at Miss Marple, who met his gaze with serene composure. She alone seemed unsurprised. Her mind, always attuned to the currents beneath the surface, sensed the web was tightening. There were secrets in every shadow of Thornhill Hall. But the shape of the truth was, at last, beginning to emerge. And somewhere Miss Marple felt sure the real motive for murder lay hidden, awaiting only the right question or the smallest, most revealing slip. Under the surface evening at Thornhill Hall brought a hush unlike any night before. A sharp breeze rattled the old panes as Inspector Croft's meeting ended, leaving a wake of unanswered questions in the drawing-room's heavy air. The last golden light of day faded behind the orchard's tangled limbs and the house's electric lamps cast nervous shadows on the walls. After the meeting, guests lingered in the corridor, awkwardly dispersing. Mrs. Bantry took Mrs. Drummond's arm, murmuring quiet encouragement, but Mrs. Drummond seemed too brittle even to thank her. Peter Linton offered Simon a stiff handshake, too formal, too brief. Only Miss Marple tarried in the drawing-room, her attention fixed not on the guests, but on the objects left behind, a crumpled handkerchief by the hearth, a ledger on the writing desk, and the faint outline of muddy footprints almost invisible against the patterned carpet. Miss Marple moved to the window and looked out. The orchard stood silent, black branches arching like the ribs of a wreck. She wondered, not for the first time, what secrets the night might reveal to eyes less gentle than hers. In the kitchen, Mrs. Dilly, the housekeeper, was fussing over the tea tray, her nerves evident in the sharp clatter of cup against saucer. Mary, the youngest maid, hovered nearby, eyes wide. "Mark my words," Mrs. Dilly said. "There'll be no peace until this is settled." Mrs. Whodunit was like a mother to us all in her way. "Never thought I'd see the day." Mary hesitated. Do you think someone in the house did it, Mrs. Dilly?" The housekeeper paused, her face drawn. "Let's hope not, child, though I've seen strange things of late. Quarrels after dark, doors closing too softly, and more. Then one letter gone missing from the post table." Mary swallowed. "I found a letter once. It was torn, only the address left, something about London. I thought it was rubbish, so I threw it away." Mrs. Dilly frowned. "Next time you bring it to me." "Too much going missing, too many secrets for my taste." Upstairs, Simon sat on his bed, hands clenched. The window rattled in its frame, and he drew his knees to his chest, staring at the door. His mind raced through memories, his father's funeral, his stepmother's anxious eyes, the way Mrs. Wilmot had clutched his hand in the garden only a week before, warning him to watch out for what's hidden in plain sight. He almost wished he hadn't returned to England. His old life in Johannesburg, though haunted by grief, had seemed simple by comparison, nothing but the dry sun, business ledgers, and the dull ache of loss. Now he felt surrounded by suspicion, by the legacy of his father, and by the gnawing sense that nothing at Thornhill Hall was as it appeared. Meanwhile, Inspector Croft walked with Miss Marple down the gravel path to the gate, his manner thoughtful. "I must say, Miss Marple, you have a way of asking the right questions. I wonder, do you have any theory at all?" She shook her head, smiling gently. "Not a full one, Inspector. I'm still waiting for a piece to fall into place. But I do believe the answer will be found in the little things: who handled what letter, who overheard which quarrel, and why Mrs. Wilmot was so determined to visit the orchard herself that afternoon." Croft nodded. "We know now that the trust in Mr. Drummond's will may not have been as straightforward as believed. But how could that threaten Mrs. Wilmot?" Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Perhaps she saw herself as guardian of more than the estate. Perhaps she feared what would be revealed if the trust were questioned. Or perhaps she feared for someone else. They paused at the gate. Croft looked up at the hall's imposing silhouette. "You think she was protecting someone?" Miss Marple said nothing, but her silence was eloquent. The following morning brought an air of uneasy routine. The village seemed eager for distraction. Children played on the green. The grocer delivered bread with forced cheer, and the postmistress spoke of little but the weather. Still, the questions gnawed at the edges of every conversation. Miss Marple visited Dr. Graham's surgery after breakfast. Having heard from Mrs. Bantry that the doctor had been seen walking near the orchard the night before the fete, long after the sun had set, Dr. Graham, haggard and impatient, met her in the waiting room. "Jane, what brings you?" "I thought you might be able to tell me a little more about Mrs. Wilmot's state of mind, Doctor." Had she seemed unwell? He hesitated, then closed the door behind them. "Edith was troubled. She didn't confide in me as much as she used to. I did find her crying once in the surgery, but she wouldn't say what it was about. Something from her past, I think. She feared she would be exposed." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Exposed for what?" Graham shook his head. "She never said?" "Only that she was worried about someone she cared for, and that a letter from London had brought it all back. I suggested she rest, but she said she couldn't not until the matter was settled." "Did she ever mention a threat, or anyone in particular who frightened her?" Graham frowned. "No, she did mention Mrs. Drummond once in passing. Said she was more vulnerable than she lets on. I wondered if that meant Cordelia was being blackmailed, but I couldn't ask outright." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing through the new implications. Later, at the vicarage, Mrs. Bantry relayed more gossip. "It seems Mrs. Wilmot's brother, who died in the war once, served in the same regiment as Mr. Drummond. Some think there was bad blood over an inheritance." "But why would that matter? Now, after all these years?" Miss Marple mused. "Because legacies are rarely what they seem, Dolly," Old Wounds confessed her when disturbed. "And perhaps Mrs. Wilmot's past was more entangled with the Drummonds than anyone knew?" That afternoon, Inspector Croft returned to the hall, this time alone, and asked to see Simon privately in the library. Mrs. Drummond watched them go with a tight jaw, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles blanched. Simon, tense, stood by. "The bookshelves, Inspector?" Croft's tone was gentle but insistent. "Simon, did Mrs. Wilmot ever speak to you about the trust? Or about your father's wishes?" Simon hesitated, then nodded. "She warned me not to sign anything. I hadn't read. She was very firm. And she said if anything happened to her, I should check the deed for a second signature." Croft wrote quickly. "Do you have the deed?" It's with Linton, at the bank, but Mrs. Wilmot left me a note. I found it in my room, hidden in a book. She wrote, "Look to the witness. Not all names are what they seem." Croft looked up sharply. "Did you show this to your stepmother?" Simon shook his head. "No, I wasn't sure what it meant. I was afraid." Croft's gaze grew thoughtful. "You've done the right thing. May I have the note?" Simon retrieved it, hands shaking. Croft read it, then pocketed it carefully. "Thank you, Simon. This may be important." Twilight gathered as Miss Marple walked the perimeter of the hall once more. Her mind, sharp and patient, churned with fragments: the witness's name, the missing letters, Peter Linton's late visits, Mrs. Drummond's strange mix of strength and fear, the old war connection. She paused beneath the orchard's trees, the grass still marked where Mrs. Wilmot had lain, and listened to the wind. She had seen it before, this web of old loyalties and new suspicions, of secrets kept out of love or fear. Sometimes the simplest Agatha forged name, a mislaid letter, could set disaster in motion. And somewhere among them, she knew, someone was watching her now, as anxious as she to see how the story would unfold. Inside Thornhill Hall, the lights blazed against the dusk, but nothing could fully banish the sense that beneath it all, the truth was waiting, poised to break free. Chapter 4, Revelations in the Dark Night, fell with a heavy, unbroken stillness over St. Aldhelm's. At Thornhill Hall, the windows shone with lamplight, but the house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress besieged. Within, every member of the household moved with quiet wariness, as though wary of waking secrets too long left undisturbed. Miss Marple, after another evening of soft conversation and careful observation at the vicarage, returned to her cottage, and sat by her window with her notebook. Her thoughts circled the same unquiet truths. The letter from Hargrave Chambers, the warning note left for Simon, the persistent oddities around the Drummond Trust. She made a careful list of names, circling Peter Linton and Mrs. Drummond together, then drawing a line to Mrs. Wilmot, witness. Her eyes lingered on the phrase, "Not all names are what they seem." Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, and then harder, rattling the panes. The sound lulled the village into a hush almost, but not quite soothing. Meanwhile, at Thornhill Hall, Inspector Croft requested one final round of interviews that evening, hoping the darkness and exhaustion might loosen tongues. Mrs. Drummond received him in the study, with Simon present at her insistence, and Peter Linton arrived, summoned by a sharp note from the inspector himself. Croft opened the discussion briskly, his eyes flicking from one face to another. "I've reviewed the trust documents and compared them to Mrs. Wilmot's note. There is indeed an irregularity in the witness signature. Mr. Linton, can you account for it?" Peter Linton stiffened. "I handled the trust, yes, but Mrs. Wilmot was the only witness on record. Her name is clearly written. If there was a forgery, I had nothing to do with it." Croft raised an eyebrow. "That is not precisely true, Mr. Linton. Your handwriting appears in the margins, and a second hand matching Mrs. Drummond's appears near the attestation." All eyes turned to Cordelia Drummond, who went pale but composed herself quickly. "My late husband insisted I add my initials as a matter of family pride. I did so without knowing it would later complicate things." Simon watched the exchange, his gaze dark and wounded. "Why didn't you say so before, Cordelia?" She hesitated. "Because I feared it would be seen as irregular, and I did not wish to give anyone cause for suspicion. I wanted only to preserve what your father left you." Peter Linton interjected. "We were all acting for the best, I'm sure. But Mrs. Wilmot may have realized the legal implications and tried to protect Simon, or the estate, from any question. She would never act for her own gain." Croft's pen paused. "So, if the trust could be invalidated, who stands to lose?" There was a silence. Mrs. Drummond and Simon exchanged glances. Linton's jaw clenched. Croft continued, "That question may answer who stood to gain by silencing Mrs. Wilmot." After the interview, Peter Linton lingered in the corridor. Simon followed, hesitating in the doorway. "Peter, is there anything you're not telling the inspector?" "Something." "About the trust?" Linton's voice was strained. Simon, I assure you, I handled only what your father instructed. But your stepmother, she feared this day would come. She worried about South Africa and about debts your father left behind. She wanted to shield you. Simon pressed further, a note of desperation in his voice. Did Mrs. Wilmot threaten to go to the police? Linton shook his head. No, never. But she did insist on seeing the trust herself after the fete. She said there was a discrepancy she could not overlook. As Simon walked away, Linton lingered, turning something over in his hand, a small, crumpled envelope. His expression, when he thought himself unobserved, was one of fear rather than guilt. In her room, Mrs. Drummond sat at her writing desk, staring at a photograph of her late husband. Her poise was unraveling. With trembling hands, she took up her pen and began to write a letter, then stopped, the words tangled in her mind. She pressed her palm to her brow, reliving that afternoon in the orchard, the sun on the grass, the laughter, the taste of fear as she realized something was terribly wrong. Downstairs, Simon wandered the corridor, pausing outside the study door. He listened to the faint voices within Croft, Linton, and his stepmother. He wondered who could be trusted. His childhood loyalty to Cordelia warred with a new suspicion, fed by grief and confusion. He thought of Mrs. Wilmot, her kindness to him after his father's death, her stern warnings, her insistence that truth is its own protection. Now that very truth seemed buried beneath layers of well-meant lies. Later that night, the storm broke, washing the village clean with thunder and torrents of rain. In the small hours, Miss Marple's cottage remained dark, but she herself was wide awake, knitting by the fire. She reviewed every step of the investigation in her mind. The letter from Hargrave Chambers, the late-night visits, the unexplained, Bruce, the secret note. Each detail seemed to shimmer at the edge of comprehension. She rose, moving to her desk, and retrieved a stack of old correspondence. From it, she found a letter from her own late cousin, who had once served as a junior clerk at Hargrave Chambers years ago. Miss Marple scanned the elegant hand, her memory stirring. Something about the format of the trust's witnesses, the manner of attestation, was not just a technicality. It was a warning, a signal intended for the wary. A knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Mrs. Bantry, breathless in the rain. Jane, forgive me for calling so late, but I had to tell you there's been another incident at the hall. Someone broke into the study. The safe was forced papers everywhere. Peter Linton's gone back to check, and Inspector Crofts on his way. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, all fatigue forgotten. Thank you, Dolly. It seems the stakes have been raised. Whoever is afraid now is very afraid indeed. Together they hurried through the storm to Thornhill Hall, their lantern bobbing along the lane. The hall was ablaze with light. Inside, Croft directed the search, barking orders. Linton stood by the ruined safe, ashen, sifting through scattered papers. Nothing's missing but the trust deed itself, he reported shakily. Everything else is here. The deed Mrs. Wilmot's only proof has vanished. Miss Marple, ever observant, glanced at the mud on the floor. There were two sets of footprints, one heavier, one lighter, perhaps belonging to a woman. She stooped to inspect the torn lining of a coat snagged on a nail near the door. Croft looked grim. It seems our murderer is still among us and more desperate than ever. As the storm raged outside, Miss Marple caught sight of Mrs. Drummond. At the foot of the stairs, her dressing gown clutched tightly, her face waxen in the lamplight. The moment their eyes met, Miss Marple saw, if only for an instant, a flicker of terrified resolve, as if Cordelia had made some silent, final decision. The search yielded no sign of the missing deed, but as the house finally quieted, Miss Marple stood in the entry hall, lost in thought. The case was no longer only about murder or about a trust. It had become a contest of secrets, of who would risk all to keep theirs, and who would risk all to reveal the truth. In the hush that followed the storm, the village slept uneasily. Only Miss Marple, ever patient, understood that the hour before dawn is when the shadows begin to thin and when the most dangerous truths are finally revealed. Traces and tensions dawn crept into St. Aldhelm's on the tail of the storm, washing the village in a wan, uncertain light. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and snapped branches. Thornhill Hall, so recently the centerpiece of summer, gaiety, now loomed over the landscape with a somber gravity. Within its walls, the aftershocks of the night's intrusion echoed through every corridor and mind. Inspector Croft, who had barely slept, took command of the hall at first light. He questioned the staff and residents once again, probing for anything missed? Any crack in alibi or emotion? The safe, its door hanging open and battered, was a mute accusation. The trust deed was gone, and with it, perhaps, the most concrete evidence of motive. In the breakfast room, Mrs. Drummond sat composed but pale, a cup of tea cooling untouched at her elbow. She wore her resolve as armor, greeting Croft with crisp politeness, but offering nothing beyond what she'd already said. Simon was absent, having wandered out into the parkland before sunrise. Croft sent a constable to find him, worried that the young man's nerves might lead him to some rash act. Linton, tight-lipped and brusque, spent the morning in the library, scouring his own files and accounting ledgers as if the answer to every question might lie hidden in a column of figures. Miss Marple arrived soon after 9, her expression unreadable, her step measured and unhurried. She greeted the inspector and Mrs. Drummond in the hall, her gentle questions as probing as any interrogation. "May I see the safe, Inspector?" she asked. "Of course, Miss Marple." "Nothing like an outside perspective?" Croft led her to the study. The safe itself was a sturdy Edwardian relic, paint flaking from its heavy door. Inside, papers lay scattered wills, correspondence, a handful of faded photographs. Miss Marple examined the mess with an experienced eye. She lifted a monogrammed handkerchief from the floor, noting a faint smear of blue ink. In the dust at the base of the safe was a small, crumpled scrap of paper. Croft peered over her shoulder. "What's that?" Miss Marple flattened the paper gently. "Keep your promise. Destroy the deed or all is lost. It's unsigned and the handwriting is disguised, but the message is clear enough." Croft took the slip, frowning. "The pressure is mounting on someone. Whoever took the deed last night may have been acting out of desperation, either to protect themselves or someone they love." Meanwhile, Simon, rain-soaked and shivering, sat beneath the twisted arms of the orchard's oldest tree. He stared at the dark, damp ground where Mrs. Wilmot's body had lain. His thoughts churned, with guilt and suspicion. He recalled the frightened urgency in Mrs. Wilmot's voice as she pressed the note into his hand. He saw in memory, the way his stepmother wept at his father's graveside, and, more recently, the cold calculation in Peter Linton's eyes as he fielded Croft's questions. Simon closed his eyes. He could not escape the conviction that the answer to all of it, the trust, the murder, the theft, was tangled in his own family's history. As twisted and knotted as the roots beneath him, a soft footstep startled him. He looked up to see Miss Marple, her rain cape gleaming with dew. "You're troubled, Simon," she said gently. "It's not easy, is it, to live in a house with so many memories and so many secrets?" He swallowed. "I keep thinking I should have done something. Stopped this before it started." Miss Marple sat beside him, her voice quiet but steady. "Mrs. Wilmot trusted you enough to warn you. She believed you could find the truth if you looked hard enough, and you're not alone. I think, Simon, that the real secret may lie in something so simple it's been overlooked by everyone." Simon's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes the witness to a crime is not a person, but a paper, or a signature, or a line in a dusty book." She smiled. "Would you help me search the library?" He nodded, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time. Back in the hall, Peter Linton confronted Mrs. Drummond in the morning room. The confrontation was subdued but intense, two adversaries cloaked in civility. "Cordelia, if there's anything you haven't told the inspector about the trust, about Mrs. Wilmot, you must speak now," Linton said, his voice low. Mrs. Drummond's hands trembled on her teacup. "I have told everything I know, Peter. My husband's wishes were clear. I have only tried to keep faith with them and with Simon." "But did you ask Mrs. Wilmot to destroy the deed?" Her composure faltered. "No, I asked her if it was possible to amend it, to protect Simon should something go wrong. She refused, said her duty was to the law, not to me. After that she avoided me. I never saw her again until she broke off, voice choked. Linton's tone softened, but suspicion lingered. If you're shielding someone yourself, Simon, anyone, it will only make things worse. Mrs. Drummond said nothing more, only stared out at the rain, eyes empty with exhaustion. Simon and Miss Marple entered the library, its walls lined with rows of leather-bound volumes and family records. Miss Marple moved directly to the lowest shelf, scanning the faded spines. "Simon, do you see any books that look out of place?" He shook his head, but Miss Marple ran her hand along the titles. "People tend to hide things where only the conscientious will notice a gap in a set, a letter out of order." She paused at a volume of poetry. Its pages were slightly warped. She drew it down and flipped through. A slip of thin paper fell out. Another note, written in the same disguised hand as the safe message. It read, "For Simon's sake, do not let the past come to light. Some debts are best paid in silence." Simon's hands shook as he read it. "Who could want to protect me this way? Cordelia? Peter?" Miss Marple's gaze was gentle. "Sometimes love makes people reckless, but love doesn't murder. That takes something else, desperation or fear." A commotion in the hallway interrupted them. Mrs. Bantry burst in, breathless. "They've found something, a woman's glove by the garden gate. It's torn, stained with ink and blood. Croft thinks it may be the murderer's." Inspector Croft gathered everyone in the drawing room to reveal the find. He held the glove aloft, evidence bag crackling. "This was found near the scene of last night's break-in. We'll send it for analysis. But there's already one clear clue, an initial sewn inside. CD." The room was stunned. All eyes turned to Mrs. Drummond, who swayed on her feet. She steadied herself, voice trembling. "That is my glove. But I lost it 2 days ago. I had no part in any of this. Someone must have taken it, used it to frame me." Miss Marple, her tone kindly but persistent, stepped forward. "Sometimes when people are desperate, they reach for the most convenient scapegoat. But a glove alone cannot prove guilt. It may, however, point us to who had access and who wished to divert suspicion." The tension was palpable. Croft nodded. "No one is under arrest. But the net is closing. I urge you all, if anyone has withheld the truth, now is the time to come forward." As the rain lightened outside, the household was left simmering with fear, anger, and suspicion. Miss Marple slipped quietly from the room, her mind racing through every new detail. Somewhere within the tangled loyalties and long-held secrets, the answer was finally coming into focus. And she knew, as surely as the morning sun would return, that the real trap was about to spring. Chapter 5. The unseen hand morning arrived pale and hesitant over St. Aldhelm's, as if the village itself held its breath. Thornhill Hall, still wrapped in the aftershocks of the recent upheaval, seemed quieter than usual, its windows reflecting a sky tinged with soft gray, the gardens shrouded in damp mist. Miss Marple was up early, her routine unbroken by the disturbance around her. Over tea and toast, she reviewed her notes, tracing connections between the scattered clues, the torn glove marked with Cordelia Drummond's initials, the too cryptic notes found in the library and the safe, and the missing trust deed. Each piece seemed part of a larger puzzle, one that remained frustratingly incomplete. Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock. Mrs. Bantry entered, cheeks flushed from a brisk walk. "Jane, I came to say I've spoken with a few more villagers. You were right. There's more to Edith Wilmot's past than we suspected." Miss Marple gestured to the seat beside her. "Do sit, Dolly. What have you discovered?" Mrs. Bantry settled down, lowering her voice. "Well, it seems Edith had family in London, a nephew, Charles Wilmot. He's been mentioned only rarely in village gossip, but it turns out he was recently released from prison. Some say he was involved in shady dealings, but Edith was fiercely protective of him." Miss Marple's eyes lit with interest. "Protective? How? Did she send him money or try to shield him?" Dolly nodded. "Exactly that. She regularly sent letters, even visited him once or twice. But there's something else. A local postman recalled seeing Edith arguing heatedly with a stranger near the station a few days before the fete. The man was described as tall, sharp-featured. Could that have been Charles? Miss Marple considered this. It certainly adds a new dimension. Perhaps Edith's troubles stemmed from outside St. Aldhelm's and not only from within. At Thornhill Hall, Inspector Croft was preparing for the inquest, which was scheduled for the following morning. He invited Miss Marple to accompany him on a final visit to the orchard, the scene of Mrs. Wilmot's death. The trees stood bare in the chill morning air, their limbs etched starkly against the sky. Croft knelt and ran his fingers through the grass where the body had lain. "There's still no sign of a weapon," he said quietly. "No witnesses, no confessions. The village remains tight-lipped. I worry this case will go cold." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Sometimes, Inspector, it's not what is found at the scene, but what's found in the hearts of those involved that reveals the truth." Croft looked at her sharply. "Are you suggesting the killer is among us still?" "I am," she said simply, "and that they're as fearful as the rest." Simon Drummond paced the library, restless and increasingly isolated. He was still haunted by Mrs. Wilmot's warning and the mysterious note she left behind. His relationship with Cordelia was strained, his doubts growing by the hour. Mrs. Drummond, meanwhile, was engaged in a quiet battle of her own. She met Peter Linton for a terse discussion in the morning room. Their voices were low but charged. "Peter," she said, "the letter from Hargrave Chambers, it must be genuine. We cannot ignore it any longer." Linton's expression darkened. "If it is genuine, it means the trust can be challenged, possibly invalidated. Simon could lose everything." Mrs. Drummond's eyes hardened. "And if someone is willing to kill to keep it quiet? We must be cautious." "Indeed," Linton replied. "But we must also find out who that is, and fast." Miss Marple decided to visit Hargrave Chambers in London. Her curiosity about the letter and the trust piqued beyond measure. She arranged with the inspector to leave that afternoon, promising to return with answers or questions deeper still. At Hargrave Chambers, the aged clerk she spoke to was cautious but cooperative. He produced a bundle of files related to the Drummond Trust, including correspondence, amendments, and witness statements. Among the papers, Miss Marple discovered a copy of the original trust deed. Its witness signature was, indeed, peculiar. The name E. Wilmot appeared, but beside it, in a shaky hand, was another name, partially erased and rewritten. "C. Drummond." The clerk explained that such alterations were uncommon and might invalidate the document if challenged. The second signature could have been added without proper authority. "Miss, if that's proven, the entire trust might be contested." Miss Marple's mind raced. The mysterious note's warning suddenly made sense. Not all names are what they seem. Returning to St. Aldhelm's, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a telegram waiting at the post office. It was brief but urgent, a summons from Inspector Croft. At the hall, Croft greeted her with a grim face. "We have a development, Jane. A man matching the description of Edith Wilmot's nephew was seen in the village last night." "A search is underway." Miss Marple nodded. "This Charles Wilmot may well be the missing piece we need." That evening, the village was restless. Shadows lengthened as storm clouds gathered once more. Miss Marple wandered the gardens alone, feeling the weight of secrets pressing close. In the kitchen, Mrs. Dilly whispered to Mary, "If that Wilmot fellow turns up, there's going to be trouble. People don't forget things easy in a village." Miss Marple paused nearby, her eyes reflecting the deepening dusk. Somewhere, she knew, the last guest awaited, the one who had set the trap so carefully and whose downfall was imminent. The gathering storm, the news of Charles Wilmot's arrival in St. Aldhelm sent ripples through the village like a sudden gust scattering autumn leaves. By midday, the local constable had received multiple reports of a man matching the description, a tall, angular figure seen lurking near the station, the pub, and even Thornhill Hall's distant grounds. Inspector Croft, ever methodical, arranged a coordinated search with his officers, while Miss Marple, quietly observing the unfolding tension, sensed the hour was growing critical. At Thornhill Hall, the atmosphere was taut with unease. Cordelia Drummond sat in the drawing room, her composure once again slipping beneath the weight of accumulating dread. She fingered the worn edges of a letter from Hargrave Chambers, the words blurring before her eyes. Simon, pacing the length of the hall, seemed on the edge of a breaking point. His usually measured manner gave way to bursts of impatience, and his sharp glances toward the windows betrayed his nervousness. The shadows lengthened outside, mirroring the darkness gathering within. Peter Linton, meanwhile, was a man under siege. His face bore the pale strain of sleepless nights, and his movements were terse and abrupt. He avoided Cordelia's gaze when their paths crossed, and his guarded silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple found herself drawn once more to the orchard. The sight of so many unanswered questions. The trees stood skeletal against the gray sky, their boughs clawing at the wind. She knelt to inspect the ground, now churned and muddied from the night's storm, searching for anything missed. Her eyes caught a glint beneath a cluster of fallen leaves, a small, intricately carved button adorned with the initials C. W. She carefully pocketed the find, her mind turning it over. Back inside, she met with Inspector Croft, who shared the latest intelligence. The man they call Charles Wilmot is not just any vagrant. We found he was recently released from prison for fraud and has a history of violence. If Edith Wilmot was protecting him, it could explain a lot. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Protection born of love or fear, perhaps, but if he has returned, what does he want here now? Money, revenge, or something else entirely? Croft's gaze darkened. Whatever it is, I suspect he's connected to the disappearance of the trust deed, and possibly to Mrs. Wilmot's death. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village post office, hoping to glean more about the letter from Hargrave Chambers. Miss Green, the postmistress, was still shaken but cooperative. The letter was sent registered, and the handwriting on the envelope was a woman's, but it was signed only with initials. C.D. I wonder if that might be Mrs. Drummond herself, she mused. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. The simplest assumptions often conceal the most. She left with a small parcel of correspondence, a bundle of letters Edith Wilmot had sent to her nephew, now handed over by a reluctant Miss Green. Back at the hall, tensions escalated. Simon confronted his stepmother in the library. Cordelia, why didn't you tell me about this letter? About the true nature of the trust? Mrs. Drummond's face was drawn and pale. Simon, I wanted to protect you. Your father's affairs are complicated and the past is tangled. I feared that revealing everything would only bring more harm. Simon's voice rose, a mix of anger and desperation. But Edith Wilmot is dead, and now the deed is missing. How can I trust anything? Or anyone? Before she could reply, Peter Linton entered, interrupting the charged moment. Simon, he said, I think it's time we all told the truth. The trust, the letters, Mrs. Wilmot there are things you do not know. Things that may explain what's happening. The three looked at one another, the weight of unspoken history settling between them. That evening, a meeting was convened at the vicarage, an uneasy gathering of villagers, friends, and those with vested interests. The vicar opened with a prayer, his voice steady despite the turmoil. Miss Marple listened as details unfolded, rumors of old disputes between families, long-held grudges, and hints of betrayal. Mrs. Bantry, nervously clutching her handkerchief, whispered of secret meetings and hushed phone calls. Croft stood and addressed the room. This investigation is far from over, but I urge anyone with information to come forward. The death of Edith Wilmot and the disappearance of the trust deed are linked, and justice must be served. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the faces present, the cautious smiles, the averted eyes, the tight jaws. Later, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple penned a letter to the inspector, outlining her thoughts. The trust deed, the torn glove, the letters, and now Charles Wilmot's sudden reappearance all pointed to a web of secrets. She suspected the murderer was not only driven by fear of exposure, but also by a desperate desire to control the legacy left behind. Her hands paused over the paper as she pondered one final thought. Sometimes, the key to a mystery lies not in the evidence itself, but in the way people react to it, their silences, their slips, their very gestures. Outside, the village clock struck midnight, its toll echoing through the stillness. Miss Marple looked out toward Thornhill Hall, a place where shadows lengthened, and the truth waited patiently to be uncovered. Chapter 6. Quiet storms the next morning dawned with a fragile brightness, as if the sun, too, hesitated to shine too boldly over the troubled village of St. Aldhelm's. Thornhill Hall, its windows reflecting the pale sky, seemed to hold its breath within its venerable stone walls. Miss Marple awoke early, a sense of purpose settling over her as surely as the morning mist over the fields. She took her breakfast quietly, then prepared to visit the village once more, intent on piecing together the threads that had begun to tangle ever tighter. Her first call was to the post office, where Miss Green awaited, clutching a small parcel of letters. "Miss Marple, I've kept these for you," letters Mrs. Wilmot sent to her nephew. "Some are recent, some old, but they tell quite a story." Miss Marple accepted the bundle with thanks and settled into the worn chair by the counter. The letters, with their flowing script and carefully folded pages, revealed a woman burdened with secrets far beyond the daily rhythms of village life. Edith Wilmot's devotion to Charles Wilmot was evident in every line, but so too was a growing fear that someone sought to undo her efforts, to silence the past she sought to protect. Among the letters, one was particularly striking, a note warning Charles not to return to England, signed only with the initials E.U. It spoke cryptically of unfinished business and a danger that lurks closer than you know. Meanwhile, Inspector Croft was busy coordinating the search for Charles Wilmot, whose arrival had stirred the village like a sudden storm. Reports placed him near the outskirts of St. Aldhelm's, but attempts to locate him had so far proved fruitless. Croft met Miss Marple at the vicarage mid-morning. "Jane, this Wilmot fellow is elusive. He knows the village and its secrets, but he's keeping his distance. I fear his return has more to do with money than reconciliation." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Money, perhaps, but also fear of exposure and the consequences that follow. He may be the missing link we've sought." At Thornhill Hall, tensions between the Drummonds and Peter Linton reached a boiling point. In the drawing room, the three met cordiality strained to breaking. "Peter," Mrs. Drummond began, "you must tell us exactly what you know about the trust and any dealings you had with Mrs. Wilmot in recent weeks." Linton's gaze was sharp. "Cordelia, I've told you and Inspector Croft everything I know. But I did see Mrs. Wilmot arguing with someone on the telephone days before the fete." She sounded frightened, urgent, almost desperate. Simon's voice broke the silence. Who was she speaking to? Linton hesitated, then said, "A lawyer from London, I believe. Someone from Hargrave Chambers?" Mrs. Drummond's lips pressed into a thin line. So the pressure came from more than just family tensions. Someone else wanted to challenge the trust. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Simon to join her in the library. Together, they began to sift through old documents, searching for clues overlooked. Simon found himself opening boxes he had long avoided: letters from his father, legal papers, photographs. Each item hinted at a past fraught with complexity and shadows. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a faint watermark on one aged letter, an emblem belonging to a secretive London law firm. "Simon, these papers show more than just family disputes. There are interests at stake you've never imagined." Simon's face paled. "Are you suggesting someone is trying to take everything from me?" Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. "And perhaps kill to keep it." Evening descended as the village prepared for the inquest. The church bells tolled solemnly, their echoes weaving through the streets. At Thornhill Hall, Mrs. Drummond sat by the fire, her thoughts heavy. The weight of loss, fear, and suspicion pressed upon her like a shroud. Simon paced nearby, restless and anxious. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying secrets older than the stones themselves. Miss Marple, preparing for the days ahead, reflected on the patterns emerging. The killer was still hiding behind a mask of civility, but with each new piece of evidence, the mask weakened. Somewhere, in the quiet heart of the village, the last guest was waiting for the final move, for the trap to spring. The inquest begins. The morning of the inquest dawned cold and gray, the kind of day where the mist clung to the earth like a shroud. St. Aldhelm's village hall, usually a place of cheerful gatherings and spirited debates, was transformed into a solemn chamber. Heavy wooden benches filled quickly with familiar faces, neighbors, friends, and those who harbored more secret curiosity than sympathy. Miss Marple entered quietly, taking a seat near the back. The air was thick with unease, and the whispers that floated around carried fragments of accusation, doubt, and fear. Mrs. Bantry, sitting beside her, clutched a handkerchief nervously, her eyes darting toward the witness's box. Inspector Croft called the proceedings to order with a measured voice. The coroner, a dignified man with silver hair, began the formalities. The purpose was clear: to determine the cause of Edith Wilmot's death and to uncover any circumstances that might shed light on the mystery. The first to testify was Dr. Graham, who described the medical findings with clinical precision. He explained the bruising on Mrs. Wilmot's neck, the lack of defensive wounds, and the probable time of death. His conclusion was unequivocal: murder. A murmur rippled through the hall. Several villagers shifted uneasily, eyes cast downward. Next came Constable Bryce, who recounted the discovery of the body and the events of the fate. He spoke of the overturned basket, the bruised apple, and the disturbed ground in the orchard. The coroner's questions then turned to the household staff. Mrs. Dilly described the day's events, emphasizing Mrs. Wilmot's increasing agitation and the mysterious letter from London. Miss Marple watched closely as each witness answered, noting the slight hesitations, the fleeting glances exchanged, and the carefully chosen words. There was much left unsaid. When the turn came for Peter Linton, the banker appeared composed but wary. His testimony touched on the trust, the recent discussions with Mrs. Wilmot, and the evening's break-in at the hall. He carefully avoided implicating anyone directly, though the tension between him and Mrs. Drummond was palpable to those observing. Simon Drummond took the stand next, his youth and nervous energy evident. He recounted his interactions with Mrs. Wilmot, the warning note she left, and his fears for the future of the trust. His voice faltered when questioned about his relationship with his stepmother, and a faint pallor crossed Mrs. Drummond's face. Finally, it was Mrs. Drummond's turn. She spoke with measured calm, acknowledging her disagreements with Mrs. Wilmot, but denying any involvement in the murder or the theft of the trust deed. Her answers were precise, yet there was an underlying tension, a strain that suggested hidden depths. Miss Marple noticed that several key witnesses were absent, most notably Charles Wilmot. Inspector Croft explained that a search was still ongoing and that the nephew's whereabouts remained unknown. The coroner adjourned the inquest until the following day, leaving the room buzzing with speculation. Outside, the rain began again, soft and persistent. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple lingered near the entrance, where she encountered Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Graham. "Jane," Dolly whispered, "there's talk that this isn't just about the trust. That old grievances, secrets from long ago, are at the heart of it all?" Dr. Graham nodded gravely. "I fear the past has cast a long shadow over Thornhill Hall, and that shadow still hides the truth." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Truth has a way of revealing itself, eventually, even if it takes time." That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple laid out all her notes and documents. The letters from Edith Wilmot, the strange notes warning Simon, the torn glove, and the missing doll pieces of a puzzle that was slowly coming into focus. Her thoughts returned repeatedly to the handwriting, the disguised script, the initials CD, and the suggestion that not all names were what they seemed. She recalled a quiet conversation with the housekeeper, Mrs. Dilly, about missing letters and whispered quarrels. There was something about the trust, about loyalty and betrayal, that was still hidden just beneath the surface. Later that night, as the village slept under a heavy blanket of rain, Thornhill Hall was restless. In a dimly lit room, Mrs. Drummond sat alone, clutching a folded letter she had found tucked away in her husband's desk. The letter spoke of old debts and promises made in shadow, of dangers that could unravel everything. Simon paced nearby, the weight of inheritance and suspicion pressing on his young shoulders. And in the darkness, a figure watched silently from the window, the last guest, waiting, patient, and ready. Chapter 7. Threads begin to unravel. The dawn broke gray and reluctant over St. Aldhelm's, casting a pallid light on a village simmering with tension and speculation. Thornhill Hall stood silent, its stately stone facade seeming more a fortress than a home, guarding its secrets behind heavy curtains and locked doors. Miss Marple rose early as was her custom, but today the familiar routine was tinged with an urgency she could not ignore. The inquest had been adjourned the previous day, and the search for Charles Wilmot remained fruitless. Yet the air was thick with whispers, the village holding its breath for the next revelation. Her first visit was to the vicarage, where Mrs. Bantry awaited with a stack of notes and rumors gathered like autumn leaves. "Jane," Dolly began as soon as Miss Marple entered, "there's talk that Charles Wilmot's appearance was no accident, that he came with a purpose, and that purpose may not be benign." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Villages rarely forget, Dolly, and when old wounds are reopened, the pain often drives people to desperate acts. Tell me everything you've heard." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. "It seems Charles was once involved with a London solicitor, the same firm that issued the letter to Edith Wilmot. Some say he was blackmailing people, threatening to expose old scandals if he wasn't paid off. Perhaps Mrs. Wilmot sought to protect her family from him." Miss Marple nodded. "That would explain her fear, but not her murder. Protection is a motive, murder another entirely." At Thornhill Hall, the atmosphere was strained as Inspector Croft convened a meeting with key individuals: Mrs. Drummond, Simon, Peter Linton, and unexpectedly Mrs. Dilly. The housekeeper's arrival caused a brief stir. Her knowledge of the household was invaluable. Croft began briskly. "Mrs. Dilly, have you noticed anything unusual since the break-in or Mrs. Wilmot's death?" The housekeeper wrung her hands. "Inspector, I have." "There have been whispered conversations behind closed doors. Letters have gone missing, sometimes replaced with forged notes. I fear someone is manipulating events from the shadows." Peter Linton exchanged a wary glance with Mrs. Drummond. Simon looked unsettled. Croft continued, "We're also reviewing the handwriting on the notes found. Mrs. Marple, any insights?" Miss Marple studied the documents again. "The handwriting is deliberately disguised, but I believe the author is someone familiar with the family, perhaps even Mrs. Drummond herself. The careful curves and subtle flourishes match samples I've seen before." Mrs. Drummond's composure flickered for a moment before she recovered. "I assure you I would never harm Edith or my stepson. But the letter I found in my late husband's desk, it spoke of debts and promises long buried. Perhaps the notes were meant to protect the family." Croft eyed her closely. "Or to mislead." Later, Miss Marple found herself walking the gardens with Simon. The young man's usual restlessness was replaced by a somber weight. "Simon," she began gently, "have you ever considered that Mrs. Wilmot's death may have been intended as a message?" He looked up sharply. "A message? To whom?" "To those who seek control, to those afraid of secrets being revealed. It is not always the victim who is the target, but what they represent." Simon nodded slowly. "I've felt that myself. The trust, the legacy, it's more than money. It's about power, about who controls Thornhill Hall's future." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Exactly. And power can drive people to dark deeds." That evening, a letter arrived for Miss Marple, slipped under her door with no signature. She unfolded it carefully. The words were brief but chilling. "Stop digging, or the next will be you. The past is buried for good." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Someone was watching, someone desperate to keep sequence. Determined to unravel the mystery, Miss Marple arranged a quiet meeting with Inspector Croft. They sat by the fire in her cottage, papers spread before them. "Jane," Croft said, "the pieces are falling into place, but I fear the killer is closer than we think." "Someone with access, someone trusted," Miss Marple nodded. "Trust is a fragile thing, Inspector, and in villages it can mask even the darkest intentions." Together they reviewed the timeline of the fate, the break-in, and the letters. Miss Marple pointed out a small detail, the bruised apple found near the orchard, the one Mrs. Wilmot had carried. An apple, bruised but not crushed, symbolizes something left unfinished. It is a subtle sign meant to be found. Croft smiled grimly. Only you could find poetry in a murder clue, Jane. The following day brought new visitors to Thornhill Hall, detectives sent from London to assist Croft. Their presence stirred anxiety among the household. Miss Marple took the opportunity to speak privately with Mrs. Dilly. "Mrs. Dilly," she said softly, "you have been loyal and discreet. But can you tell me if you noticed anything unusual about Mrs. Wilmot's behavior in the days before her death?" The housekeeper hesitated. She was uneasy, Miss Marple. Afraid even. She mentioned hearing voices at night, footsteps when none should have been there. And she once showed me a letter she'd received from an unknown sender. Did she say what it contained? No, but she said it threatened to undo everything she'd worked to protect. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with understanding. Thank you, Mrs. Dilly. Your insight is most valuable. As night fell once again, Miss Marple stood by her window, the village below cloaked in shadow. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together: the trust deed, the forged notes, Charles Wilmot's threat, the broken promises. Yet one question remained. Who among them was willing to kill to keep Thornhill Hall's secrets buried? Somewhere in the darkness, the last guest waited patiently, unaware that the trap was closing. The trap tightens, the early morning mist clung stubbornly to the hedgerows and lanes of St. Aldhelm's as the village stirred awake. Thornhill Hall, looming large against the soft gray light, seemed more a citadel than a homoplace where old secrets and fresh fears intertwined beneath every shadow. Inside, Miss Marple was already at work. Her notebook lay open, filled with observations, contradictions, and half-formed theories. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, eyes flicking over the names and dates, the letters and cryptic notes. The arrival of detectives from London had added weight to the investigation. Inspector Croft, though grateful for the additional expertise, remained respectful of Miss Marple's insights. The case was no longer just about the death of Mrs. Wilmot. It had grown into a complex web of loyalty, deception, and power. The day's first meeting brought the household together once more. Mrs. Drummond appeared more fragile than before, her usual composure replaced by a quiet tension. Simon's youth and unease were more evident, while Peter Linton's guarded silence weighed heavily in the room. Inspector Croft began with measured authority. "We have reason to believe that the missing trust deed was taken deliberately to obstruct justice. We must find it before the inquest resumes." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Croft. "Sometimes, Inspector, what is sought is not just an object, but control. Control over past and future." Peter Linton broke the silence. "Cordelia, we must be honest. If the trust is invalidated, the estate could fall into the hands of those with less regard for its history. We cannot allow that." Mrs. Drummond's hands clenched tightly. "I have only ever wished to protect Simon and preserve my late husband's wishes." Simon's voice was low but steady. "Then we must find the deed and the truth." Later, Miss Marple took time to speak privately with Mrs. Dilly. The housekeeper's eyes held a wary intelligence. "Mrs. Dilly, have you noticed anyone acting suspiciously since Mrs. Wilmot's death?" Mrs. Dilly nodded slowly. "There was something odd last night. I heard footsteps in the corridor near the library long after everyone had retired. When I looked, no one was there. But the window was open, a window that rarely gets used." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "The library window? That might explain how the deed disappeared." Mrs. Dilly added quietly, "And I found a scrap of paper on the floor near the window this morning, a torn piece with writing on it. I gave it to the inspector." Miss Marple and Inspector Croft examined the scrap, a small piece of parchment. With the words, "The past will catch those who try to bury it," Croft frowned. "A warning or a threat?" "Perhaps both," said Miss Marple. That afternoon, Miss Marple and Simon searched the library thoroughly. Among the bookshelves, they found a small hidden compartment, an old, forgotten place where someone had tried to conceal the trust deed. The deed itself was gone, but nearby lay a small velvet pouch containing a silver locket. Simon opened it with trembling fingers to reveal a faded photograph of a young woman, beautiful, but with eyes that seemed to hold sorrow. "Who is she?" Simon whispered. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Someone whose story may be key to unlocking this mystery?" Meanwhile, Peter Linton met secretly with one of the London detectives. Their conversation was hushed but urgent. "I fear the truth will ruin us all," Linton said. "The stakes are higher than anyone imagined." The detective nodded gravely. "We will uncover what must be uncovered. No one is beyond suspicion." That evening, as the village settled into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple stood beneath the ancient oak near the orchard. The wind stirred the leaves like whispered secrets. She recalled a phrase from one of Edith Wilmot's letters: "Only the last guest will see the trap laid bare." Somewhere within Thornhill Hall, the final pieces were moving into place. The trap was set, and Miss Marple, with all her gentle cunning, was ready to spring it. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. The day was crisp, with a pale sun filtering through the clouds as Thornhill Hall prepared itself for the final act. The village was quiet, a delicate tension hanging in the air as neighbors glanced toward the ancient estate, knowing that today the mystery would either be laid to rest or deepened forever. Inside the grand drawing room, the key players gathered, at Miss Marple's quiet invitation. Inspector Croft presided, while Mrs. Drummond, Simon, Peter Linton, Mrs. Bantry, and a handful of trusted villagers took their seats, curious and wary. Miss Marple, dressed simply yet with an air of composed authority, stood before them. Her eyes twinkled with a gentle fire that belied her age, and her voice carried the quiet weight of long experience. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "We are here to understand what happened to Mrs. Edith Wilmot and why. But first, let me tell you a story, not one of crime or scandal, but of human nature, trust, and deception." She paused, letting her gaze settle on each face. Mrs. Wilmot was not merely a housekeeper. She was a guardian of secrets, of legacies, of truths too fragile for many to bear. She held knowledge that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed lives of those here. Simon shifted uneasily, but Miss Marple continued. The missing trust deed was not simply a piece of paper. It was the key to control, to power, and to inheritance. Mrs. Wilmot's warnings, the notes, the letter from Hargrave Chambers, all pointed toward a tangled web woven long before any of us were born. She looked now directly at Peter Linton. "Mr. Linton, you claimed your dealings with the trust were straightforward. Yet you were seen visiting the hall late at night before the fete. And last night you were found near the library window, the likely point of entry for the thief." Linton's face paled, and he glanced toward Mrs. Drummond, who watched in silence. Miss Marple stepped closer. The torn glove with Mrs. Drummond's initials was a clever red herring, planted to shift suspicion. But the handwriting on the notes, carefully disguised, was your own. Linton's composure cracked. "You have no proof." "On the contrary," said Miss Marple, "I have proof of your desperation. The forged notes, the break-in, your fear of the trust's exposure. You attempted to secure the estate's future for yourself by silencing Mrs. Wilmot, who threatened to expose the irregularities you orchestrated." Croft stepped forward, producing a bundle of letters and financial documents. "We've found correspondence revealing your attempts to manipulate the trust, to hide debts and divert funds." Linton's eyes flickered with defeat. "I only did what was necessary. The estate was failing. I did it for the family." Mrs. Drummond's voice, steady and cold, cut through. "And in doing so, you destroyed trust, friendship, and a life." Simon's face was a mixture of shock and sorrow. Miss Marple turned to him gently. "Simon, your stepmother's involvement is innocent. She sought only to protect you, but Mr. Linton's greed blinded him." She then addressed the room. The bruised apple found in the orchard, a symbol of something imperfect and hidden, was left near the scene as a subtle cry for help, from Mrs. Wilmot herself, perhaps. The room was silent, the weight of truth settling upon them all. Miss Marple concluded, "This case was not merely about a stolen deed or a murder. It was about the choices we make when faced with fear, greed, and loyalty. And it reminds us that even the smallest clue, a torn glove, a misplaced note, a bruised apple, can unravel the most carefully kept secrets. Inspector Croft nodded gravely. Mr. Linton, you are under arrest for the murder of Edith Wilmot and related offenses. Linton's protestations were weak, overshadowed by the certainty of justice. As the arrested man was led away, Miss Marple smiled softly, looking around the room. Let us hope Thornhill Hall can now find peace. Mrs. Bantry took her hand. Warmly. Jane, as always, your wisdom has brought light to the darkness. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet satisfaction. It is never the cunning of the criminal that wins, but the patient observation of those who watch and listen. As the villagers slowly dispersed, the hall seemed to breathe again, its shadows retreating before the dawn of truth. Outside, the orchard stood peaceful. The bruised apple, now a simple fruit lying on the grass, its silent message finally understood.